for Kildonan and St. Paul.
On that same point of order, I'd like to add my comments to the question of privilege raised by the member of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford on November 7th concerning the 14th report of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, to which I am Vice Chair. And I would echo the comments, many of the comments made by the Bloc Québécois member, who's also Vice Chair of the Public Safety and National Security Committee. Conservatives are certainly very concerned with the display we saw at Public Safety Committee on November 5th by Ms. Lauren Chen. Now, as you may be familiar, Mr. Speaker, our committee is studying the impact of Russian disinformation in Canada, and certainly all committees have heard testimony and from this study and from others that certainly Russian interference in Canada is a very serious matter. They're looking to sow division, to sow discord in Canada, and they ultimately want Canada to fail. They want Canada to be weak. It is a very serious matter of what's happening in the Western world from Russia, and we are studying that as a matter of priority in public safety over the last few weeks. And what happened on November 5th was, I found, quite appalling and quite an affront to our ability to have accountability tools to hold people and ministers and others accountable as a check on power that we have as official opposition members and as members of the committee. And so Ms. Chen was at first, in fact, invited to willingly come to committee to answer quite serious allegations. There's a Department of Justice in the United States, an indictment that involves her company, Tenant Media. The allegations in that indictment are that her company, Tenant Media, received $10 million from covert agents from Russia Today for the purposes of spreading influence through her platforms of Russian propaganda. Quite a serious matter, and really an issue that would be at heart of what we're discussing at committee. And so we invited her. Again, her testimony was certainly welcomed by all parties, but she refused to come willingly. And given the shocking allegations against her company and against herself and the covert actions that she allegedly engaged in some of them are actually quite shocking. She invited other influencers to come speak and failed to, as the allegations go, failed to inform them where funding was coming from, failed to inform them allegedly of the influence Russia Today had on her platform. And so all of these individuals were sharing their message under Tenant Media, which was being influenced by Russia according to the allegations. So very serious matter, and certainly as topical regarding our study. So she was invited, she refused, the committee unanimously agreed to summon her. She came, and then I've never been witness to this. I know it has happened rarely, though it has happened at other committees, but she refused to answer any questions. Even as the Bloc member pointed out, she had asked her name. She wouldn't even answer the question of what her name was, let alone important questions that we had about the influence Russia Today had, which again is a propaganda arm of Russia, who again is looking to undermine and weaken Canada, what involvement she had in playing along with that and receiving millions of dollars to do it. Very important questions, Mr. Speaker, that I think are of primary importance to the health of our democracy and certainly our ability to hold wrongdoers accountable. And she refused to answer. And so the NDP member and the Bloc member have outlined, and I would agree with their assessment on various regulations and certainly our ability, as outlined in the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, 2017, on pages 1078 to 79, which of course states the following, as you well know, that witnesses must answer all questions which the committee puts to them. So we agree with that very much, and I know you know procedure likely better than anyone other than perhaps the experts sitting at the table in front of you, which we all rely on. But I would say, just even beyond that, Mr. Speaker, when you're considering this matter, this question of privilege, I'd ask you to consider the impact your ruling will have. Do we want to allow, as parliamentarians, as committee members, this precedent to be set, which I would argue is a very dangerous precedent to set for the accountability mechanisms we have as parliamentarians? If this is allowed to go ahead and Ms. Chen is not called to the bar or is held accountable for her lack of responding, what does that say to all other witnesses? What does that say to perhaps government ministers of any political stripe? What does that say to anyone invited to committee who's just a bit uncomfortable or for whatever reason of their own does not want to answer questions? What does that really say? What your ruling, I think, will set is that either Parliament believes that's unacceptable, people must come to committee to answer questions, or they don't have to if they don't feel like it. And so I'd ask for you to consider what this precedent will set moving forward, because I think it will be quite impactful. If Ms. Chen gets away with her bad behavior without a clear reprimand, I think that would be deeply impactful and concerning for Parliament and for our ability of committees to hold wrongdoers accountable. And again, she has not been convicted of anything. She actually hasn't been formally charged. But what we are saying and what we are concerned with that committee is that she took money from Russia to further their propaganda to undermine Canada and other Western actors. And so even regardless of what she was there to talk about, which is very serious and we need those answers from her, but regardless of what it is, if she's allowed to get away with that without a reprimand from Parliament, as we've seen with Christian Firth and others, I do feel that that is, again, a very dangerous precedent to set for accountability. We are saying as Parliament that it's okay if you can come and you don't have to answer any of our questions. And committee does incredibly important work, as you well know. All the committees are seized with critical issues right now. And so if we have witnesses that come and don't have to answer, what are we all doing this for? What is our duty as parliamentarians at committee? What is our duty as opposition members if people can just show up and say nothing? And we have, of course, in our rule books, we have as precedent for hundreds of years, people have to come and answer questions. She did not do that. And in fact, I found that it was quite insulting to the institution at large, to parliamentarians at the table who have been duly elected by the Canadian public to fulfill their duties. We've been appointed to committee. Our duty is to hold people accountable, to gather expert testimony, to finalize reports, to issue recommendations to Parliament, to ensure Canada and Canadians are well aware of what's going on in these critical issues that they are concerned about. And of course, Russian disinformation deeply impacts us all, just like interference from China, interference from India, interference from Iran and Pakistan. This is not a nothing issue. This is a critical issue impacting modern democracies and impacting the foundations and the security of our institutions. So I'd ask you to consider, of paramount importance, the precedent that your ruling, whatever it will be, will set. I think given, and I'd also ask that given all parties support this and have supported this every step of the way, that this is in fact not a partisan issue. This has nothing to do with somebody's political leanings. This has nothing to do even with the issue itself, although serious as I have outlined. It is the fact that the question is, can people come to committee and disrespect Parliament by saying nothing? I would say no, and I would hope that you would agree, sir, after you review this and rule on this question of privilege. So Conservatives have supported, we've been in lockstep with other parties on this. I think that speaks volumes, that for once we are united on something. It is a very serious matter, Mr. Speaker, and I'd ask that you use the tools at your disposal and at Parliament's disposal to ensure anyone who's doing this is held accountable. And again, just to conclude, on the specific matter that Ms. Chen was called to committee about, as a patriotic Canadian, as somebody who loves this country and is honored to serve it in this capacity, I was quite appalled to read that indictment and to think that a fellow Canadian is taking money from a foreign government to undermine the Canadian interest. And I was quite appalled as a parliamentarian to sit there across from someone who refused to answer for her own actions, who didn't have the integrity to answer for what allegedly she had done. And so there's a lot in here that I think sets quite a precedent, and I'd ask you to holistically consider those things, and at the end of the day consider, as parliamentarians, has our privilege been violated, that when someone is invited to committee, again by all members and summoned by all members to answer questions on something of this importance, this magnitude of importance, and even if it's any other issue, do we not have the privilege to hear answers to those questions? Is that not centuries old of tradition? And if someone is allowed not to answer, what does that say about the strength of our democracy? What does that say about the committee process? What does that say out of our ability as duly elected parliamentarians to hold people accountable? I think that calls into question all of those powers. So I think this is a much bigger question of our democratic institutions, Mr. Chair, and I'd ask that you consider that holistically and really think about the seriousness of the decision you may set and the precedent that will set. But ultimately, the Conservatives believe that committees should be used and the powers that we have to hold wrongdoers accountable, and certainly to hold people accountable for, it's tough to say this in this House because it's a very serious allegation, but someone who may very well be a traitor to this country needs to be held accountable for not coming to committee and answering questions on those allegations. Mr. Speaker. So I'd ask you to consider that. As a patriotic Canadian, the Conservatives want to see people held accountable. They want to see our powers maintained. They want to see respect for this place maintained. And it happens with decisions that you are about to make. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.